He knelt beside a single drum in a dim Los Angeles studio long before machines could imitate rhythm. Each beat was his heartbeat, steady, patient, and human. For hours, he built the rhythm of a song one sound at a time, refusing to stop until it was perfect. The man was Leon Sylvers, the quiet architect behind the groove that would carry American soul into a new age. His music shaped the nights of countless listeners, yet his own name rarely echoed beyond the studio wall. How does someone like Leon Sylvers create the sound of an era and still remain unknown to the world that danced to it? Let's get into his story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before the bright lights of Los Angeles, before the gold records and the endless studio nights, there was a boy born in Indiana on the 7th of March, 1953, Leon Frank Sylvers III. His first home wasn't a mansion filled with instruments, but a modest university hospital in South Bend, where his father was studying. Just 3 days later, the family packed their things and moved south to Memphis, Tennessee, chasing work, hope, and the American dream. In those early years, Memphis was alive with sound. Gospel spilled from church doors, and blues wandered through the streets. The Sylvers family carried music not as a profession, but as a way of living. Leon's mother, Shirley, was a trained opera singer, her voice floating through the small home like a morning prayer. His father, a man of patience and precision, taught the children harmony not as theory, but as unity. 4 voices blending together to survive hard times. By the time Leon was 2, the family boarded a train to Los Angeles. They settled near Adams and Kenshaw, a growing neighborhood filled with working families and quiet ambition. For Leon, it was the sound of a city changing. The radio hummed with Motown hits, and somewhere between the static and the soul, he found his calling. He was only 7 when he first heard bassist James Jamerson and drummer Benny Benjamin. Their groove wasn't just rhythm, it was storytelling. And from that moment, Leon knew that music could speak without words. Inside the Sylvers home, harmony was a family rule. His father would gather the children in the living room and say, "Find your note, hold it, don't let go." Leon, Charmaine, Olympia, and James sang in tight, 4-part harmony like the 4 freshmen, blending pop precision with gospel warmth. Shirley, ever the teacher, corrected posture, phrasing, and breath. Their voices filled the small apartment until the neighbors stopped by just to listen. It was the sound of a dream forming quietly in the background. When Leon was around 8, he began to imagine himself as a Motown writer. He'd sit near the window with a notebook, pretending to compose songs for artists he'd never met. It started as play, but soon became habit. He taught his brothers and sisters the harmonies he heard in his head, molding them into a little choir of children who could shift from jazz to pop without missing a beat. Their mother called them the Little Angels, a fitting name for a group of kids singing about love, hope, and belonging in a city that was still learning to give them those things. The Sylvers children began performing at local talent shows. Their blend of smiles, rhythm, and clean harmony stood out in the growing Los Angeles scene. During one competition, they sang without instruments, their voices carrying the rhythm like a heartbeat. The crowd clapped in time, unaware that the boy leading them, the one playing the bass line on his knee, was teaching himself how to arrange songs. Leon wasn't just performing, he was studying sound. After their parents separated, life became heavier. Shirley worked hard to keep her children out of trouble, especially the boys. Watts was changing fast. Gangs, poverty, and protest were shaping the neighborhood. Yet through all of it, Leon kept writing. Music was his escape, his order amid the chaos. At school, he was quiet, often drifting off during lessons, hearing melodies no one else could. By his teenage years, the dream started taking shape again. The family regrouped as the Sylvers, determined to turn their harmony into a career. They entered a local talent contest in 1970 and won easily. Their voices were seasoned, their choreography sharp, and their energy contagious. Word spread quickly. People compared them to the Jackson 5, another family act taking America by storm. Leon didn't mind the comparison. He admired the Jacksons, but he also knew their paths were different. The Sylvers had the street grit of Los Angeles, the layered harmonies of Memphis, and the discipline of classical training. At 17, Leon was already thinking like a producer. He began experimenting with sound, recording himself on tape, layering bass lines, claps, and vocal parts. He could hear songs before they existed, a skill that would later make him invaluable to every artist he touched. When the Sylvers performed at Verbum Dei High School, their a cappella harmonies stunned the audience. A record executive named Mike Curb happened to be in the crowd. By the next week, the family was signed to MGM Records. Still, for Leon, signing a deal wasn't the end, it was the beginning of responsibility. He saw himself as the glue, the arranger, the caretaker of the family's sound. While his younger siblings practiced choreography, Leon stayed up late reworking bass lines and melodies. He wanted every song to lock, as he'd say, meaning every sound had to fit like pieces in a perfect puzzle. It wasn't fame that drove him, it was precision. Even as a teenager, he believed that rhythm was spiritual. Each note carried memory, history, and emotion. Every performance was an act of balance between heart and discipline. And though the world didn't know it yet, Leon Sylvers was already building the foundation of something far greater than a family act. He was crafting the rhythm of the next generation. Before the record labels, before the bright jackets and gold plaques, there was only the hum of a small apartment in South Los Angeles, and a boy who refused to let a single note fall out of place. When the Sylvers signed with MGM in 1971, the excitement in their small Los Angeles home was electric. After years of singing in school gyms and community halls, the family was finally stepping into the same world that had once felt unreachable. Leon was just 18, yet he carried himself like someone who had been producing records for decades. He wasn't just another member of the group, he was its compass. Their first recordings came quickly. Songs like Fool's Paradise and Wish That I Could Talk to You introduced a fresh kind of family harmony. The world saw them as another pop R&B group in matching outfits. But Leon heard something deeper. While the public compared them to the Jackson 5, Leon was chasing a grittier sound, one built on rhythm, texture, and groove. He spent nights studying bass patterns, replaying tracks by James Jamerson, and then writing his own lines that spoke through movement rather than melody. In the studio, Leon was known for being patient but relentless. If a snare hit was off by a fraction, he'd stop the session. "It has to lock," he would say, and the band knew he meant it. Even their producer at the time, Jerry Butler, admired the young man's precision. "He's got the ear," Butler said. Leon didn't just want hits, he wanted perfection. His vision pushed the Sylvers beyond being another family act. He wanted them to sound like the streets of Los Angeles, smooth yet alive with tension. By 1972, the group's self-titled debut had reached the R&B charts. For most young artists, that would have been enough. But Leon was already planning the next step. He started writing songs that highlighted each sibling's strength. Misdemeanor, performed by his younger brother Foster, became a breakout single, a playful track built around Leon's unmistakable bass line. It reached the top 10 on the R&B chart and brought the group into heavy radio rotation. Behind every beat of that record was Leon's hand, guiding each note like a craftsman shaping wood. Success brought attention, but also pressure. MGM saw the Sylvers as a bubblegum soul group, bright, youthful, easy to market. Leon disagreed. He wanted substance. He wanted the kind of sound that would make people feel the pulse of real R&B, not just dance to it. While others saw a young man chasing fame, Leon saw himself as a builder, crafting something timeless. The years that followed tested that vision. When the label began favoring another family act, the Osmonds, the Sylvers, were quietly pushed aside. For Leon, it was a familiar Hollywood story talent overshadowed by image. But he didn't complain. He studied. He learned the politics of the music business, understanding that staying silent often taught more than speaking out. At home, he continued writing, stacking melody on top of rhythm with the same patience he'd learned as a child. He knew that someday the world would catch up to what he was hearing in his head. Every night, before he turned off the light, he'd hum a line, record it on a small tape, and label it simply, idea. It wasn't ambition, it was faith. Faith that the sound inside him had a purpose. Faith that someday his music would no longer hide behind anyone's name. The late 1970 period was a crossroads for Leon Sylvers. The Sylvers had found moderate success, but something inside him began to change. He loved his family, but he couldn't ignore the sound that kept echoing in his mind, a sharper, deeper rhythm that didn't fit within the polished pop image the label wanted. While his siblings rehearsed dance steps, Leon was in the back room with a bass guitar, searching for a new language in sound. In 1975, the group released Boogie Fever, a glossy, radio-friendly hit that climbed to #1 on the Billboard chart. The world loved it bright, catchy, and easy to sing along with, but for Leon, it was bittersweet. He saw the record's success as both a blessing and a box. He knew they could do more than bubblegum pop. He wanted to create soul that lived and breathed beyond the charts. While others celebrated, Leon quietly realized that his future might not be as a performer, but as the man behind the music. By 1978, change became inevitable. He started producing and writing independently, driven by an obsession with rhythm and structure. When the family's contract ended, Leon made a choice that few understood. He stepped away. To some, it looked like a split. To Leon, it was liberation. He wasn't walking away from music, he was walking toward his real purpose. That same year, fate introduced him to Dick Griffey, the founder of Solar Records, a man who shared his belief that soul music could evolve without losing its heart. Griffey had seen the Sylvers perform years earlier, impressed by their live energy. But it was Leon's quiet control, his way of commanding sound, that caught his attention. He remembered the young man who never missed a beat. Now, standing face to face, Griffey gave Leon an opportunity that would change both their lives. Griffey handed him the reins to a new act called Shalimar, a trio with potential but no direction yet. Leon didn't hesitate. He walked into the studio as if he'd been waiting his entire life for this moment. Within weeks, he shaped their sound, sleek, percussive, full of movement. He built the groove layer by layer, his bass lines carrying both discipline and emotion. The result was electric. Shalimar's records, especially Take That to the Bank, brought a new kind of energy to R&B, polished but still human. It was the start of a new era, the solar sound. Behind the control board, Leon looked calm, almost detached. But those who worked with him could see it in his eyes, the focus, the quiet intensity. He didn't shout, didn't boast. He simply adjusted a knob, rewound the tape, and made perfection happen. Artists trusted him because he listened. He understood their rhythms even before they played a note. As the decade closed, Leon had transformed from a member of a family group into one of the most promising producers in Los Angeles. He wasn't chasing fame anymore. He was shaping it for others. His work began to ripple through the industry, whispers in studios, radio DJs asking, "Who produced this?" And every time, the answer came softly, Leon Sylvers. He once said, "When you find your sound, you don't chase the spotlight, it finds you." And in that moment, standing under the dim light of the Solar Studio, Leon Sylvers wasn't just finding his sound. He was building the future of R&B. By the start of 1980, Leon Sylvers was no longer just a producer. He was the quiet architect behind a movement. Inside the Solar Records compound in Los Angeles, the nights were long, the walls alive with music, and Leon's bass seemed to pulse through every room. Artists came and went, some dreaming of fame, others desperate for another hit, but Leon stayed behind the board, unbothered by the spotlight. He had found his purpose in the rhythm itself. The first wave of success came with Shalimar. Their sound, polished yet deeply soulful, defined a new identity for R&B, bright, modern, and irresistibly danceable. Leon guided them through tracks like Take That to the Bank, and later, The Second Time Around, songs that became instant classics. He had a gift for turning studio imperfections into art. If a singer's note cracked, he'd smile and say, "Keep it, that's the soul." What others might fix, Leon felt. And audiences could feel it too. From Shalimar, his influence rippled outward. He became Solar's creative backbone, producing for the Whispers, Dynasty, Lakeside, and even mentoring young engineers who would later shape the sound of the 1980 decade. When And the Beat Goes On by the Whispers hit #1 on the R&B chart in 1980, the groove that carried it was pure Leon, a bass line that walked confidently through every bar, subtle but unforgettable. The song was more than a hit. It was a statement that R&B could evolve without losing its soul. Leon worked like a craftsman, not a celebrity. He'd arrive before everyone else, tuning each element by ear. No matter how advanced the equipment became, he still trusted his instincts more than the meters. He once told a young engineer, "Technology can measure volume but not feel." That philosophy shaped the Solar sound warm, layered, and deeply human. As the success grew, so did the circle around him. Artists like Dynasty and Lakeside started requesting Leon by name, not just for his production but for his calm. He created a safe space in an industry built on ego. People felt seen when they worked with him, and that respect found its way into the music. You could hear it in the syncopation, in the spaces between the notes, the kind of silence that only a true producer could conduct. By mid-1981, Leon was at his creative peak. Radio stations across the country played his work almost every hour, sometimes without realizing it. His bass lines drove the pulse of urban America, from New York clubs to Los Angeles streets. But fame, in the traditional sense, still avoided him. He didn't appear on magazine covers, didn't chase interviews. And yet, his sound was everywhere in car radios, roller rinks, and wedding receptions. He had become part of people's memories without ever stepping into their view. Those who knew him said Leon never raised his voice in the studio. He didn't need to. He communicated with rhythm, the quiet command of someone who understood how to make a song breathe. Even when the lights went down and the tape stopped spinning, the air still carried the pulse of his work. For Leon Sylvers, the early 1980 era wasn't just success, it was vindication. The kid who once practiced harmonies in a small apartment now controlled the heartbeat of modern soul. And while others celebrated on stage, Leon stayed behind the glass, nodding gently to the groove he had created. It was his way of saying everything he'd ever wanted to say without a single word. Success in Los Angeles is often loud, flashing lights, endless parties, and headlines written faster than truth can catch them. But for Leon Sylvers, success was quiet. He never cared for the noise. His reward was in the moment when a mix finally clicked, when the bass, the snare, and the voices all found that invisible pocket of time that made everything feel alive. Still, even in the middle of his greatest triumphs, Leon began to sense the silence waiting just beyond the applause. Inside Solar Records, pressure was mounting. The label wanted more hits, faster, glossier, bigger. What started as a creative family had begun to feel like an assembly line. Leon, who once built songs out of pure instinct, now found himself negotiating with executives about formulas and trends. He'd walk into the studio early, alone, tuning the bass by ear, just to remind himself why he started. But the industry around him was changing. New machines, new expectations, new people who thought soul could be programmed. At times, Leon felt invisible in his own creation. Artists he had mentored were now headlining tours, accepting awards, giving interviews. They'd thank their fans, their families, sometimes even their managers, but rarely the man who had built their sound. He didn't resent them. That wasn't his way. But when the lights dimmed after a session, he would sit in the empty control room, staring at the console glowing faintly in the dark. He knew how quickly music could forget its makers. The balance between creation and recognition had always been fragile. Leon was humble by nature, but humility doesn't shield a heart from fatigue. He began to withdraw, focusing more on the technical side of production, the craft he could still control. Colleagues noticed a shift. The smile was still there, but the spark behind it seemed softer, guarded. It was as if the man who once pushed everyone toward perfection was now protecting himself from disappointment. Yet, even in that quiet detachment, Leon continued to create. He worked with Dynasty, The Whispers, and new acts emerging under Solar's banner. Each record carried traces of him, that signature groove, the unspoken warmth that could turn even a synthetic track into something human. But as the 1980 decade moved forward, a new sound began to dominate the airwaves. Digital beats, sharper production, colder emotion. The warmth Leon had spent years perfecting was slowly fading from mainstream radio. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had helped build the very path that would later leave him behind. You could say he created the standard so well that the industry stopped needing him to keep it alive. That's the cruel rhythm of Hollywood. It remembers the sound, but forgets the soul that made it. Still, Leon didn't complain. He had always believed that true legacy doesn't need headlines. When friends asked if he missed the spotlight, he would just smile and say, "The light was never mine to begin with." To him, every artist he helped was proof that the work mattered. But in those late nights, when the studio went silent and the tape reels stopped spinning, he could feel the echo of everything he had given. Leon Sylvers stood at the top of his field, yet felt unseen, a man surrounded by music, but haunted by the quiet that came after it. And as the city outside kept chasing the next sound, Leon stayed where he had always been, behind the glass, listening, waiting, and remembering what it felt like when rhythm still meant truth. By the middle of 1984, the rhythm that once drove Leon Sylvers began to slow. The industry that had depended on his groove was now chasing new machines, new faces, and a sound that no longer needed the human touch he valued. Digital production was taking over, replacing warmth with precision, and Leon, the man who built songs with his hands, his heart, and his instinct, suddenly found himself out of place in the world he helped create. He could feel it in every studio session. Younger producers came in with samplers and drum machines, bragging about how they could do in minutes what used to take Leon hours. He would smile politely, watching the blinking lights, remembering when perfection meant something more than a preset. He wasn't bitter, just aware that the sound of time had changed its tempo. When he released his own solo album under Motown in 1989, it was meant to be a quiet declaration that he still had something to say. The record was tasteful, refined, and deeply soulful, everything Leon was. But the world barely noticed. Radio stations had moved on, chasing a colder groove. He had poured decades of experience into that music, yet the silence that followed its release was louder than any applause he had ever received. Behind the scenes, his personal life mirrored the music. He was tired, not from failure, but from the effort of constantly rebuilding himself. Producing had always been his refuge, the one place where control and emotion could coexist. Now, that refuge felt distant. Friends said he seemed quieter, more withdrawn. He stopped attending industry events, choosing instead to work with younger musicians in smaller studios, helping them find their sound the way he once had. They didn't always know who he was, but when they heard his advice, they listened. He carried the calm authority of someone who had already seen both sides of the dream. Leon never complained publicly, never blamed anyone. He understood the rhythm of history. Every generation needed its own beat, but the truth still lingered. The more the world automated its music, the less it seemed to need men like him. He once told a close friend, "Machines don't make mistakes, but they also don't feel regret." That line stayed with him, part confession, part prophecy. As the late 1980 period gave way to the 1990 wave of hip-hop and New Jack Swing, Leon's influence began to reappear, this time through samples. Young producers were cutting and looping his old bass lines, building hits out of fragments he had created years earlier. They didn't always credit him, but Leon recognized the rhythm instantly. He smiled quietly when he heard them on the radio, echoes of his past, hiding inside the music of the future. Still, there was no escaping the isolation that success leaves behind. He had built so much for others that he had forgotten how to build for himself. Some nights, sitting alone in his studio, he would turn on the old reels of tape, listening to the hum of recordings that no longer made it to air. Each note was a memory, each pause a small reminder that even greatness can be lonely. For Leon Sylvers, the crisis wasn't a fall, it was a fading. Not a loss of talent, but of time. The world kept moving forward, but the rhythm he believed in, the rhythm that once defined him, was slowly slipping out of reach. When the lights finally dimmed on the era he helped create, Leon Sylvers found himself in a quieter world. The phone that once rang day and night grew still. The studios that used to echo with his bass now pulsed with younger producers chasing a different kind of perfection. And yet, the silence didn't break him, it revealed him. He had always believed that a true musician could hear music even in the absence of sound. So when the work slowed down, Leon began to listen again. He listened to his old recordings, to the laughter of his brothers and sisters captured faintly in the background of early takes. He listened to the hum of the tape machines he once guarded like sacred relics. And somewhere in that stillness, he found peace, not pride, not fame, just the quiet knowledge that he had left something real behind. But but the industry rarely pauses to look back. By the early 1990 period, Leon's name had faded from liner notes, replaced by new producers with flashier credits. The very sound he pioneered, that warm, layered R&B groove, was now being recycled in new forms. Rappers and beatmakers were sampling his bass lines, lifting grooves from the Whispers, Dynasty, and Shalimar, turning them into the backbone of a new generation's anthems. Leon didn't fight it. In fact, he smiled when he heard them. To him, it was proof that his rhythm had survived, even if his name had not. Still, there were moments when the past felt heavy. He would see younger artists performing songs he had helped build, their faces shining under stage lights that had once felt like home. No one mentioned him, and maybe they didn't even know, but that was the nature of the business. Memory fades faster than melody. He had learned that long ago. Leon began mentoring quietly. He worked with up-and-coming musicians, guiding them through arrangements, showing them how to make a song breathe. He never charged much. He simply wanted the craft to live on. Those who worked with him said he spoke softly but carried the weight of truth. "Don't chase the trend," he would tell them. "Chase the feeling." He knew the difference. He had lived it. As the world entered a digital age, Leon's philosophy became almost radical. He didn't resent technology, but he believed that no machine could replace emotion. He stayed connected to music through collaboration, writing, co-producing, helping others find what he once found in himself. In 1989, when his song "Let's Go Through It" quietly became a stepper's favorite among R&B purists, it was as if the universe had whispered back, "We still hear you." And though it wasn't chart-topping success, it was validation, a small reminder that real music never disappears. There were no big farewells, no documentaries, no grand comeback tours. Leon Sylvers simply faded into the background of the very sound he created, content to let others shine. But in the silence that followed, the rhythm never stopped. You could still hear it in every city, every club, every late-night drive where someone turned on an old record and felt that familiar pulse, warm, steady, unmistakably his. When the cameras stopped rolling, Leon didn't chase the spotlight. He simply turned down the volume, smiled, and let the music speak for him just as it always had. For some artists, legacy is built on headlines, awards, and the glitter of fame. For Leon Sylvers, it was built in silence through bass lines that became part of America's heartbeat, through songs that lived longer than the charts that once listed them. Even as the world moved forward, traces of his touch remained everywhere, hidden in plain sight inside the music that came after him. By the early 1990 period, a new generation of producers began to uncover the foundation Leon had laid years before. They listened to his work with Shalimar, the Whispers, and Dynasty, studying how he blended melody with rhythm, how every beat felt alive, even without words. Among them was a young musician named Teddy Riley, a visionary who would lead the new jack swing movement. Riley later called Leon one of his greatest influences, saying he taught him how to make lyrics live inside the groove, how to marry melody and movement without losing emotion. When Riley's group Blackstreet released "Before I Let You Go," its structure carried Leon's DNA, the smooth bass line, the conversational rhythm, the emotional restraint. The teacher's rhythm had quietly shaped the student's revolution. Leon's guidance reached far beyond Los Angeles. In the 1990 decade, he co-wrote and co-produced tracks with Riley for major acts, including Guy and New Kids on the Block. Each collaboration was a bridge between eras, the analog soul of the 1980 decade meeting the digital pulse of the 1990 generation. Leon understood the transition better than most. He knew that music would change its tools, but not its truth. And his presence in those sessions, even if uncredited by the public, reminded everyone that the groove must always have a heart. Meanwhile, R&B historians began to trace the lineage of the solar sound, that signature warmth and bounce that defined an era. They realized that behind the polished records, there was a man whose sense of rhythm had become a template for countless others. Producers like Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis often mentioned Leon's influence on how they structured their bass and percussion layers. The groove, once considered simple, was actually a complex web of feeling, timing, and restraint, the art of knowing when not to play. In interviews, Leon rarely spoke about legacy. He didn't use the word. To him, music was never about being remembered. It was about remembering where the sound came from. But those who worked with him knew what he had built. They saw it every time a new artist came into the studio asking for that solar feel, not realizing they were chasing the soul of Leon Sylvers. His songs continued to echo through the years. Clubs still played "And the Beat Goes On," and the second time around, their grooves sounding as fresh as the day they were recorded. You could walk into a roller rink in Chicago, a cafe in London, or a radio station in Tokyo, and still hear his rhythm, the universal language of joy, love, and motion. Few names traveled that far, but his sound did. It moved across borders quietly, just as he always had. In 2009, when he co-produced the album Pink Elephant by Mbambi, it felt like a circle closing Leon working alongside his own son, Leon Sylvers IV. The album earned a Grammy nomination for engineering, proof that even decades later, his ear for balance and tone had not aged. For Leon, it wasn't about recognition. It was about passing the rhythm forward. He had once learned harmony from his father. Now, he was giving that same lesson to his son, that the real legacy of music is not in fame, but in continuation. In the years that followed, people began to look back at the sound of the late 1970 and early 1980 decade and realized just how much of it carried Leon Sylvers' fingerprint. Critics called it the heartbeat of modern soul, a rhythm that bridged Motown's discipline with Los Angeles cool. You could hear it in nearly every R&B track that came after the smooth glide of the bass, the layered vocals, the warmth that made synthetic instruments feel human. What Leon had quietly created had become the blueprint for generations. Music journalists started writing retrospectives on the solar era, revisiting albums by The Whispers, Shalamar, and Dynasty. What they found wasn't just nostalgia, it was structure. Each song carried a certain balance between groove and grace, emotion and control. It was the kind of sound that didn't age because it was never trendy to begin with. It was timeless by design, built on feeling rather than formula. And at the center of it all was Leon, the man who refused to rush a rhythm, who taught the world that restraint was its own kind of power. By the 2000 decade, his influence could be felt not just in R&B, but across pop, hip-hop, and even electronic music. Producers sampling his work often discovered that they couldn't improve it, only reinterpret it. The groove was already perfect. Hip-hop legends from the East Coast to the West borrowed fragments of his bass lines and turned them into new stories, carrying his legacy into a culture that didn't even know his face. But Leon didn't mind anonymity. For him, the fact that his rhythm was still alive was recognition enough. Among musicians, Leon became a symbol, the musician's musician. Young artists sought him out, not for fame, but for wisdom. He would tell them, "Music isn't about showing off what you can do. It's about showing the world what you feel." Those who listened walked away changed. Many of them later credited him as a mentor, a quiet teacher who restored soul to a business that often forgot what that word meant. In interviews later in life, Leon spoke softly about the past. He never complained about being overlooked. Instead, he smiled and said, "Some of us were never meant to be stars. We were meant to light the path." That line captured everything about him: humble, reflective, and unwavering in purpose. He had lived through the rise and fall of entire musical eras, yet his rhythm never wavered. It was the same steady pulse he first played as a boy on a homemade drum, the same rhythm that once carried the Sylvers, and later, a whole generation of sound. When he received the Grammy nomination in 2010 for Pink Elephant, the industry's belated nod to his craft, it felt less like a comeback and more like a recognition of something that had always been there. For Leon, it was never about award. It was about continuity, the idea that every song, every artist, every beat was part of one endless composition. Today, when fans rediscover his music online or stumble across one of his records in a dusty crate, they don't just hear notes, they hear history. They hear the heartbeat of a man who turned discipline into art and silence into rhythm. And even though the world may never fully know how much of its music bears his touch, those who listen closely will always recognize the sound of Leon Sylvers not as an echo, but as a living pulse that refuses to fade. In the quiet corners of Los Angeles, there are still studios that carry the faint hum of Leon Sylvers' rhythm. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it: the soft pulse of a bass, the whisper of harmony, the heartbeat of a man who built his life around sound. He never chased fame, never demanded recognition. He simply created until the music felt honest. And in a world that often celebrates noise over truth, that kind of integrity is rare. Leon's story isn't one of tragedy. It's one of devotion to craft, to family, to the art of listening. He didn't disappear. He simply stepped aside, letting the rhythm he built continue without him. Every generation that sampled his work, every singer who borrowed his feel, every producer who tried to recreate that warmth, they were all keeping his music alive, even if they didn't know it. There's something profoundly human about the way his life unfolded. He reached the top of his field without ever standing in the spotlight. He shaped the sound of American R&B, then faded into its fabric like the steady hum beneath a melody. And maybe that's the purest form of success, to leave behind something that outlives your name. Today, when fans rediscover "And the Beat Goes On" or "The Second Time Around," they often find themselves moving without realizing why. That's the Sylvers touch rhythm born of heart, discipline, and quiet faith. It reminds us that greatness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it just keeps time in the background, waiting for the world to listen again. As we look back, Leon's story becomes more than just the tale of a musician. It's a reflection of what every artist fears to be forgotten and what every true creator hopes to be remembered, not for fame, but for impact. He proved that you don't have to be the loudest voice to leave the deepest echo. If you ever find yourself wondering where soul went, listen again. You'll hear him there in the bass line that feels like a heartbeat, in the groove that never quite lets go. Leon Sylvers didn't just make music. He left a rhythm that still moves through every note we call timeless. Do you think Hollywood ever gave Leon Sylvers the respect he truly deserved? If this story moved you, subscribe to Stars Underrated and help keep the light of forgotten legends alive. Because remembering, that's how music lives forever. And some stars, like Leon Sylvers, never fade. They just shine quietly, waiting for someone to listen.